Good evening. This is Politics and Bourbon, and this is our weekly editorial commentary, where we go over the editorials from the Sunday New York Times and the Sunday New York Post. If you excuse the background, I'm traveling for work right now, but I will say that this Sunday's editorials are a little bit short on information, as everybody seems to be obsessed with Greenland and Iran and a few other things, but we'll go through them anyways. Um, we're going to start out with the New York Times commentary. Behold Donald of Deliria, which is by Maureen Dowd, who is usually a pretty good writer. But basically, it talks about how Trump has gone from being an isolationist to being a 19th century imperialist looking to carve up South America and the world, Greenland, Venezuela. And here's the interesting thing. It's a misunderstanding of the America First agenda. The America First agenda, whether it's Trump's or whether it was the right wing of the Republican Party prior to the Second World War, the America First agenda basically is a fairly simple agenda. It's that the Western Hemisphere is America's, and all other countries should stay out of it. And outside of the Western Hemisphere, America will have a military that has the capability to intervene anywhere in the world and win. Hence Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet and the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But that it would only be used in a couple of cases. One, if there was an international situation where American interests were directly affected, in which case America would intervene militarily, or if it was an ally or a country that we had an allied arrangement with where only America could provide the necessary support. A perfect example of that would be, for example, the 12-day strikes that Israel made on Iran. Israel did most of the heavy lifting, and the one thing they couldn't do, which was heavy bombers with bunker buster bombs, America did. And it was a single strike. And depending on which expert you talk to, it set Iran's nuclear program back between 2 and 8 years. And we simply came in to do the one thing the Israelis did not have the technological capacity to do, which was heavy stealth bombers with bunker buster munitions. But in terms of, but that is the America First agenda. The America First agenda is that is not pull up the gates and everybody stays home and we don't leave the continent of the United States. It's the Western Hemisphere is ours, and we will intervene outside of the Western Hemisphere if American interests or we have an ally that needs help that only we can provide, and we choose to do it. So I think it's a vast misunderstanding to think that Trump's on some imperialistic binge. He is very much kept to the same program that he's kept to since the beginning of his first term. Now, when it comes to Greenland, I can tell you, as someone who has a lot of friends in Washington, that Trump does not want control over the 56,000 citizens of Greenland, nor to make Greenland a 51st state. That is just part of the art of the deal. I don't know if liberals need to actually read his book, but his book's main premise is that you start with an outrageous request, and then you back down to what you actually want. America needs two things out of Greenland. One is we need to control the external security of Greenland and have full rights to build anything militarily we want on Greenland. The Golden Dome, which I have to admit I'm not a huge fan of the name, is essentially the modern incarnation of Reagan's bluff that was Star Wars. But now we actually have the technology to actually make it work. The problem is that one of the key components of it, because of the way that satellites orbit, is you need to be able to place THAAD and Patriot and ground-based mid-course interceptor missiles and nuclear missiles in Greenland. And where you have to place them in Greenland happens to be in an environmentally sensitive area. And the problem is that right now, Greenland, which is a territory of Denmark, which is slight irony that a nation who claims a vast territory far away from their own little European country, that an imperialist power like Greenland, that has kept its imperialism over Greenland, should accuse the U.S. of imperialism. I don't see the Danes offering the Greenlanders their independence anytime soon, or even thinking about it. But the problem is that the Danes, like all European governments, move slower than molasses moving uphill in winter, which means that we need control over Greenland's defense, and we need the rights to put anything that we require militarily in Greenland. And if we have to negotiate for that because of environmental reasons, you're talking about a negotiation first with the Danish government and then with the Greenlandic government, because the Danish government does allow Greenland to have semi-autonomous powers. That means that in order to put a single missile base there, whether it's Aegis Ashore or THAAD or ground-based mid-course interceptors or nuclear weapons, which we will have to place there, the negotiations alone on that will take 15 years. And we don't have time for that. We don't. The northern shipping routes are opening up, and in order to make Golden Dome work, we need that stuff there, and we need it there in the next 2 to 3 years. And we do not have time to negotiate through Denmark first and then through Greenland. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Greenland, despite what the liberals are saying, which is, oh, well, they've got, 39 million tons worth of rare earths, but they're hard to refine. Well, all rare earths are hard to refine. It's one of the pain in the asses about rare earths is that they are incredibly hard to refine. You have to process an incredible amount of material to get a relatively small amount of rare earths. And the rare earths in Greenland aren't as high quality as they are elsewhere. But the technology exists to economically extract them. And if we had the ability to extract all those resources from Greenland, the oil, the gas, and particularly the rare earths, we could completely sever our European allies, for that matter, need to rely on China for any rare earths. Unfortunately, the idea of strip mining Greenland, even though you'd be talking about only couple of 100 square miles of a gigantic piece of real estate that would be strip mined through the ice, is upsetting to the uber-sensitive Europeans and their environmentalism. The Europeans, the Danes have the luxury of being Western European. If you'll notice, the countries who sent token troops to Greenland are all countries in Western Europe. The countries in Eastern Europe understand America's needs and support America. You don't see the Poles sending troops, or the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Hungarians. And the reason why you don't see that is because Denmark and France and Germany and Spain can afford to take a lax view of their own security, because they realize that Russian tanks would first have to roll through Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and Poland before they get to them. Spain's prime minister, the reason why he doesn't care about NATO defense spending is because he realizes it's very unlikely that Russian tanks will make it all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains. And so this whole issue is kind of a moot point. America doesn't want Greenland to be a territory. America or Trump doesn't want Greenland to be a territory. We don't want to have the 56,000 Greenlanders as citizens. What we want is two things: full control over the resources of Greenland, which we will share the profits with the governments of Denmark and Greenland, and allow us to be completely independent of China when it comes to rare earths. And, most importantly, the ability to base nuclear and conventional weapons anywhere in Greenland. So that's the first part, and it goes. This particular article, "Behold Donald of Deliria," talks about how Trump has made some massive change. He hasn't. He hasn't. He hasn't changed. America first means American interests first. American interests are the Western Hemisphere first, and then the greater world as it pertains to America's vital security interests and the interests of allies when it comes to things that only America can do. The next editorial is also from the New York Times. It's, "For Trump, justice means vengeance. President Trump is celebrating the anniversary of his return to power by celebrating his attack on the rule of law. Using the mighty powers of the Justice Department as an extension of his personal and political interests, he has started a fabricated criminal investigation of the Federal Reserve Chair, searched the home of a former Washington Post reporter, and created a White House-controlled fraud unit that would streamline partisan prosecution." This is interesting. I would say that Trump's use of the DOJ for revenge or to get what he wants politically is not the wisest move in Washington. Better to take the high road. However, it's kind of funny coming from the New York Times, which is the same paper that when Letitia James was trying Trump, was basically treating Trump like Al Capone. Doesn't matter what we get him on as long as we get him on something. And so they had no problem with the weaponization of the DOJ against Republicans, and particularly Trump. But somehow when Trump does even a tiny fraction of what the Biden administration did, they're very upset about it and are calling it a threat to democracy. When, like I said, just 6 years ago, 5 years ago, they were treating Trump like Al Capone. In other words, doesn't matter what we get him on as long as we get him on something. There's this line: "His usurpation of law enforcement power threatens us all." Well, why wasn't it a threat when Biden was using it against Republicans and against Trump? But it's suddenly a threat when the Republicans and Trump are using a fifth of the revenge power of the DOJ. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I think taking the high road on it and leaving it alone is a better idea for the administration, because the problem is that it ends up being a tit for tat. The Democrats use the DOJ for revenge. The Republicans are using it not as much, and that just makes it makes it a regular part of politics, which is not good. Where if you take the high road, you can attempt to put an end to using the DOJ for revenge politics. But it is hypocritical for, I believe, the New York Times to be crowing about how using the DOJ for revenge is somehow a threat to democracy. Let's see this last phrase. "1 year into a second term, America risks losing a central feature of our democracy, that we are a country ruled by laws and not by one man." I find it hysterical that they didn't have that same opinion when Biden was using it. The next thing: Latin America as a stage for U.S. imperial ambitions. President Trump has become increasingly entangled in Latin American politics. Less than a year into his second term, he seized the president of Venezuela, imposed sanctions on Cuba and Nicaragua, and threatened Mexico with airstrikes and Colombia with a coup. He has imposed crushing tariffs on Brazilian exports, sent deportees to El Salvador's infamous Supermax prison, pressured Panama to limit China's influence, and meddled in the internal politics of Honduras and Guatemala. Mr. Trump's turn towards Latin America isn't surprising, for often during times of global turbulence like the moment we now find ourselves in, presidents seek safe harbor there. Latin America is where U.S. leaders have projected power beyond their borders, not only with brute force, including all those coups Washington orchestrated, but with moral suasion as well. And he talks about how Reagan went for Latin America in a big way. But the fact is that when it comes to Latin America is a funny place, and South America is a funny place. Um, it has always been, since the Roosevelt Corollary, the logic that the most important thing was to keep foreign actors out of Central and South America. And that by any means necessary. And if that means that a pro American military junta is a better guarantee of pro America stances from South American nations rather than an elected democracy, then a military junta is what we will back. Also, it's important to remember that Latin America doesn't generally tend to go socialist. They call it socialism, but it's communism. Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, these are states that, well, Cuba calls itself communist, the other ones call themselves socialist, but they are communist. And the problem with communists is that communism is an interesting idea. It's an idea that has never worked, but for some reason just won't die. Every time that it doesn't work, they say, oh, it just wasn't done right. Well, it's never worked. And so, but the problem is that its adherents become almost ideological. Karl Marx called religion the opiate of the masses. But the problem is that communism itself is a religion, and communists develop an almost ideological fervor. A staunch communist is as staunch in their belief and their willingness to die for their belief as any jihadist is for their belief, even though one is religious and one isn't. Marx got rid of the opiate of the masses by replacing it with a political version of that opiate. And so the problem is that you've got two choices with a communist country in South America. You can take the Colombian route, which is you install a democratically elected government or a military junta, and you try to bring the rebels to bear, the communist rebels to bear. In which case, in Colombia's case, you end up with 60 years of the FARC going into the jungles and fighting a communist guerrilla insurgency. Or you take the Pinochet effect, or the Brazilian junta effect, which is the Brazilian military junta and Augusto Pinochet in Chile, who did a coup on Allende in the early 70s, in which case you get a general who is willing to make all of the leaders of the communists, all of the high-ranking members, all of the older members, all of the old guard, suddenly disappear. And once enough of them disappear, and unfortunately disappear does mean dead, suddenly the rest of them aren't quite as willing. So in other words, anybody that would be willing to fight to the death and to propagandize others to fight to the death for the cause of communism, you make sure they die before they can impose that. It works. It does work. It gets rid of communists. Communists are like cockroaches. If you don't kill enough of them to make the rest stand down, then they will go into the jungles, they will form guerrilla groups, and they will continue, not unlike the jihadists of the Middle East. And you will end up fighting generation after generation after generation of them. So it's distasteful, but arguably the Brazilian and Chilean route is the more effective route long term. I personally believe that's what will eventually happen in Venezuela. Currently, the immediate need is being met by the vice president, who has chosen, as the Mexican cartels would say, silver over bullets, and is doing what America says. But that won't last long, because there are true believers around the vice president who will turn her back towards communism. In which case there will need to be a strong leader in Venezuela that is willing to do what is necessary to put a permanent end to Chavismo and the communists there. The same thing will happen in Nicaragua, and the same thing will happen in Cuba. Venezuela was the only thing still propping up Cuba. Now that Venezuela is no longer supplying aid to Cuba, Cuba will face 20-hour-a-day blackouts of electricity in 3 months and famine of medicine and food in 6 months. So Cuba will fall in 6 months. Now that Venezuelan aid, the oil that Venezuela exported to Cuba, which it then refined and sold off at a profit, was the only thing keeping the Cuban state alive and on life support. So Cuba will fall, and you will need a strong leader to take Cuba as well over, and a strong leader to make sure that the communists are put down and don't return. The next article is also from the New York Times. This is not how a normal president speaks. It's quite interesting. They are comparing Donald Trump to Andrew Jackson, which is kind of funny considering Trump actually deeply respects Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was also hated by the press and nicknamed King Andrew I because of his expansion of executive power. But they also say that Trump talks threateningly about Greenland in what appears to be a naked land grab fueled by dreams of 19th century territorial expansion. And they say that's just because it's the nearest large land mass on a map, and that's all Trump can think of. But like I said earlier in this video, in reality, Trump does not want Greenland. I swear, no liberal has ever read The Art of the Deal. Trump's negotiating style, whether good or bad, you can argue with it. It's not a negotiating style that everybody should use. But essentially what it is that you essentially troll a person, and you start with a completely unreasonable request, and then you back out to what you actually want, which sounds reasonable but wouldn't have sounded reasonable if you had started with it. And so that is Trump's perfect example. That is that when Trump was building Trump Tower in New York City, Tiffany & Co. owned the air rights to the tower. And if Trump wanted to build his tower as tall as he wanted to, he needed to buy the air rights from Tiffany & Co. And Tiffany & Co., for some reason, didn't get along with Trump. And it's one of the reasons why Trump always bought his diamonds from Graff rather than Tiffany's, which is another jeweler. But what he did is he had his architects design two buildings. One was the building that became Trump Tower, which now is a little 1980s and a little dated, but at the time was very, very, very decadent and beautiful. 50 years ago. But one was Trump Tower, which required the air rights from Tiffany's, and one was a tower that was much smaller. But the much smaller tower, he asked the architect to design the ugliest building they could possibly think of. And he gave Tiffany's a choice. He walked in, excuse me, and said, you can sell me the air rights and I'll build this beautiful tower. Or you can not sell me the air rights and I will build this incredibly ugly building right next to your store. And Tiffany's didn't believe him, but once they realized that he was absolutely serious, that he would be willing to build a store just to spite them, he would be willing to build an ugly building just to spite them, that he was serious, and they called and sold him the air rights so he could build his tower. And so that is kind of Trump's negotiating. It's a very New York way to negotiate. It's a very tough stance. It's not nice negotiations. It's not polite negotiations. And also Trump also does, and I'll do a longer form video on this, but it's actually a political strategy called reconnaissance through action. And it's fairly common in other parts of the world. But reconnaissance through action means is that it's a theory that you throw out a ridiculous idea and you start essentially trolling people about that idea. And you see how they react. And it's your way to very, very quickly judge what the exact limits of your uh, opponents on the other side of the negotiating table are. Because you make it so ridiculous that they immediately, their defenses immediately go up. And you see immediately exactly where their limits are. And those limits, if you had done polite diplomatic negotiations, may have taken months of negotiations to figure out where those limits were. But by doing something outrageous, you find out those limits immediately. And then you can work with that. It gives you an advantage. So, like I said, is Trump's negotiating style for everyone? No. Is it polite? No. Is it diplomatic? No. It's very New York business. But it is successful most of the time. Problem is, it's messy. The nice thing about traditional diplomacy is very clean. Traditional diplomacy is summits and polite talks, and it's very pleasant, and it's very clean, and it's very calm. And that's how traditional diplomatic talk works. Reconnaissance through action and Trump's way of negotiation is down and dirty. It's meant to get things done quickly. But the problem is that it is messy. The process of the sausage making is messy, and that could have an effect both on markets and on people. And so it's interesting because we've not had a president that chose to negotiate. Almost all other presidents have chosen the diplomatic means. Andrew Jackson didn't, Teddy Roosevelt didn't, but for the most part, most of our presidents have chosen the pleasant, very slow-moving diplomatic way of negotiating. Trump doesn't. Trump negotiates in his own way, and it's not him alone. It's reconnaissance through action. It's a very known form of negotiation, but it can be upsetting if you don't stand back and look at the 10,000-foot view and see the wider picture of what is being attempted. The next article is The View from Taiwan on Chinese Aggression. And it talks about how it basically goes into what the worst case scenario of a likely strike on Taiwan would be from China. The first warning sign might be quiet moves by Beijing to move financial assets away from Western countries that might freeze them in a war. A second might be patriotic campaigns in China calling on citizens to donate blood. Then, amid troop movements and debates about whether these constituted a genuine threat or were a bluff, cyber attacks might disable a chunk of Taiwan's electrical grid, and banking system in the island's internet service would grow sluggish because of the sabotage of undersea cables linking Taiwan to the world. Missiles would strike the presidential office and military intelligence sites in an attempted decapitation, and perhaps also American bases in Japan and Guam to keep American forces from riding to the rescue. Chinese ships would blockade Taiwan, with special focus on keeping the United States and Japan from providing assistance. That is an extreme version of what an initial Chinese attack over Taiwan might look like, drawn from conversation with military planners. Pentagon strategists worry about such invasion scenarios. That is actually the most likely invasion scenario. Right now, the Taiwan Strait Risk Report says that in the next 5 years, there's a 30% chance of a Taiwan invasion, a 60% chance of a Taiwan blockade by China. The problem with the blockade is the blockade would most likely lead to almost the same level of battle as an invasion would, because Taiwan is an island with no natural resources. Therefore, a blockade would be a make or break moment for the island. So the real question is what's going to happen when it occurs. There's a reason why Trump is doing deals with Taiwan to move foundries to the U.S. Um, Taiwan, as an island, is important because it's democracy. It's part of the first island chain, and it helps contain China. But it's not absolutely vital to contain China. It is absolutely vital, however, that the chip making capacity in Taiwan not fall into Chinese hands. Because if it did, it would mean the Chinese would be in control of some 70+% of the high tech chip manufacturing equipment. So, by moving that technology to America and to countries outside of the Asian hemisphere into the Western hemisphere, whether to America or other countries in the Western hemisphere, is that you have a secondary option. Uh, you can defend Taiwan while at the same time destroying all of the chip fabs in Taiwan, either through American airstrikes, American missile strikes, or the Taiwanese doing it themselves, to deny those from China. Chip fabs are very, very, very fragile pieces of industrial manufacturing. A couple of well-placed explosives, and you can completely destroy a chip fabrication plant. And so you can essentially make it useless to the Chinese. And if you have that technology already based somewhere else, you can quickly expand it and limit the international disruption caused by an invasion, a blockade, or shortages. The Taiwanese themselves, the older generation, is still willing to consider a Hong Kong-like scenario, even though it didn't work out so well for Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to have many decades of one country, two systems, and that ended a few years ago. Hong Kong is no longer the same Hong Kong it was 15 years ago in terms of its level of freedom, when it should have been, because it's quite a few more decades until the official time frame of one country, two systems runs out. But the younger generation in Taiwan absolutely does not want China and will fight against China. And with America's help, every war game shows that we win. So the Chinese, it would be a mistake for them to invade Taiwan. That is one of those rare instances where Trump, despite his Western Hemispheric isolationist stances, would intervene, because Taiwan is vitally important, both to the world and to American interests. It's part of the island chain that allows us to block in China. However, it doesn't mean Z won't go for it. There are a lot of people in Washington who firmly believe that 2027 will be the year that China attempts a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan. Other people believe it'll be later than that, but I don't know anyone that's projecting it after 2035. Everyone's projecting it by 2035. And so we shall see what happens, but that is the reason why Trump is going to be asking for a massive increase in the defense budget next year. You could be looking at a $1.5 trillion defense budget next year, because the one thing about a war with China over Taiwan would be that you need a tradable hardware. Technology allows us to significantly limit the actual manpower losses that we suffer, the blood that's spilled. But we need the equipment also. We need to be able to lose equipment to the bottom of the Pacific and have replacements for it already lined up. And we are working on that diligently as a country, and it's why Trump, most of the increase in the defense budget, the idea of moving the defense budget to $1.5 trillion. And I'm going to do a longer form video on this about how $1.5 trillion actually isn't a lot of money for defense when you consider the fact that if you took our Cold War defense spending and escalated the dollar value, we'd be spending about $1.92 trillion a year on defense. We need a tradable military hardware. That means you need to be able to lose very expensive, very high-tech military hardware to the bottom of the ocean and have the ability to replace it. Well, anyways, that is the editorials. Not a lot this week, given the fact that everything is so focused, for the most part, on Iran and on Venezuela and on Greenland. But come back to us this coming Sunday for another discussion on the editorials, which it's amazing because these are supposed to be very educated people, but they seemingly drink the Kool-Aid and don't seem to be able to take a 10,000-foot view. These are, like I said, supposedly very educated journalists who are taking a very myopic view on world events and on how this administration is behaving without seeing the bigger picture, even though they're smart enough to see the bigger picture. So, until next Sunday, stay safe. Expect 2 more long-form videos this weekend on reconnaissance through action and on the upcoming defense budget and why it's important. And other than that, have a great week and stay safe out there. Have a wonderful day. Bye. And again, this is Politics and Bourbon. Please support us on our Buy Me a Coffee link. Hope everyone is having a great week, and we'll see you this weekend. Bye.